Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. In a world where survival meant choosing between compassion and safety, one cowboy's heart refused to let him walk away. In the harsh wilderness of the 1800s Old West, a weathered cowboy discovers a frightened baby wolf trapped in a rancher's iron gate. Though wolves are seen as dangerous predators threatening livestock, he cannot bring himself to leave the creature to die. His act of compassion sets off a chain of events that would challenge everything the frontier stood for. Rival ranchers accuse him of endangering their herds, while the wolf pup begins to follow him, forging an unlikely bond between man and beast. In a land where survival often comes at the cost of mercy, the cowboy's choice challenges the frontier code and reveals a softer side to the West. But what happens when that same wolf returns the favor in a way no one could imagine? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Cedar Ridge, like an old man's breath in winter. Air carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Jake Morrison adjusted the worn leather saddle beneath him, feeling the familiar creak that had become as much a part of his daily rhythm as his own heartbeat. The saddle had been his companion for 15 years now, its surface weathered smooth by countless miles under the vast Montana sky. Every scratch and stain told a story. Some he remembered fondly, others he wished he could forget. At 43, Jake carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned life's lessons the hard way. His face, lined by sun and wind, bore the map of years spent in the elements. Gray touched the temples of his dark hair, and his hands, rough from rope and reins, moved with the practiced economy of someone who wasted neither motion nor words. He was not a large man, but there was something in his bearing that suggested depth, like a still pond that ran deeper than it appeared. Cedar Ridge sprawled below him in the valley, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to have grown from the earth itself rather than been built upon it. The town served a practical purpose: supplies, mail, and the occasional social gathering. But it was never meant to be beautiful, and it made no apologies for that fact. The general store's false front had been whitewashed once, years ago, but now it wore the gray-brown patina of Montana winters. The saloon's bat-wing doors hung slightly crooked, and the church steeple listed just enough to catch your attention if you looked too long. Main Street stretched like a dusty ribbon between the buildings, wide enough for wagons to pass, but narrow enough that neighbors could call to each other from opposite sides. On most mornings, you could count the early risers on one hand, old Pete sweeping the steps of his barbershop, Martha hanging laundry behind the boarding house, and Sheriff Tom Bradley making his morning rounds with the methodical pace of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. Bradley was a good man in the way that frontier towns measured goodness, fair, steady, and not easily rattled. He had been the law in Cedar Ridge for 8 years now, ever since the previous sheriff had decided that California's warmer climate suited his constitution better than Montana's bitter winters. Tom was built like the oak trees that grew along the creek, solid, dependable, and deep-rooted. His mustache had gone completely gray in the past year, but his blue eyes still held the clarity of a man who slept well at night. The relationship between Jake and the sheriff was built on mutual respect and careful distance. They understood each other in the way that men of similar experience often do, without needing to speak of certain things. Both had seen enough of life to know that good intentions didn't always lead to good outcomes, and that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the same as the safe thing to do. Jake's reputation in Cedar Ridge was that of a man apart, not unfriendly, but not seeking friendship either. He was known as the best horseman in 3 counties, with an almost supernatural ability to read animals and weather alike. Ranchers sought his services when they had a particularly difficult Mustang to break, or when they needed someone to track strayed cattle through terrain that would challenge lesser men. He commanded respect for his skills, but he also puzzled people with his solitary ways. The truth was that Jake preferred the company of animals to that of people. Horses didn't lie, didn't scheme, and didn't break promises they never intended to keep. They responded to fairness and consistency, qualities that Jake had found in short supply among his fellow humans. His small spread, 5 miles north of town, was modest by local standards. Enough to run a small herd and maintain his independence, but not enough to draw the attention of men like Samuel Hayes. Hayes was the valley's largest landowner, a man who had arrived in Cedar Ridge with money and ambition in equal measure. He owned the Circle H Ranch, which sprawled across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, and he had made no secret of his intention to expand further. Hayes was the kind of man who measured everything in terms of ownership and control, including relationships. He served on the town council, funded the new schoolhouse, and made sure everyone knew about his generosity. But Jake had never trusted Hayes, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the way the man's smile never quite reached his eyes, or how he spoke of the land as if it were just another commodity to be bought and sold. There was something in Hayes's manner that reminded Jake of men he had known during his time in the cavalry, men who saw other people as pieces on a chessboard to be moved and sacrificed as strategy required. The morning air carried the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, a low, musical complaint that spoke of creatures comfortable in their routine. This was the rhythm of life in the valley, predictable, seasonal, governed by the needs of animals and the demands of weather. Spring brought calving and roundups. Summer meant long days moving herds to higher pastures. Autumn brought the harvest of both crops and cattle, and winter was the time for mending equipment and planning for the year ahead. Jake spurred his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger, down the slope toward town. Ranger was not the most beautiful horse in the valley, but he was reliable in the way that mattered most to a working man. The horse had an easy gait that could cover ground all day without tiring, and a calm temperament that remained steady in situations that might spook a more spirited animal. Like his rider, Ranger was built for endurance rather than show. The worn leather saddle creaked in a familiar rhythm as they made their way down the hillside. Jake had bought the saddle from a retiring cavalry officer in Fort Benton, and it had served him well through countless rides. The leather had been broken in by years of use, molded to fit both horse and rider with the kind of comfort that money couldn't buy new. Every mark on its surface told a story. The deep scratches from a panicked horse's hooves, the dark stains from rain-soaked nights on the trail, the smooth spots worn by the friction of ropes and daily use. It was more than just equipment to Jake. It was a connection to a way of life that was already passing into memory. The frontier was changing, becoming more settled and civilized with each passing year. The railroad had reached Helena, bringing with it new ideas about progress and efficiency that didn't always sit well with men who had carved their livelihood from raw wilderness. As Jake reached the outskirts of town, he could see the early morning. Activity beginning to stir. Smoke rose from chimneys as families started their breakfast fires. The blacksmith's forge was already glowing, ready for another day of shoeing horses and repairing tools. The sound of hammering echoed across the still air, a metallic percussion that spoke of work beginning early and ending late. There was comfort in these familiar rhythms, Jake reflected. Life in Cedar Ridge moved at a pace determined by necessity, rather than ambition, by the needs of animals and crops, rather than the demands of clocks and schedules. It was a life that allowed a man to think, to notice the small changes that marked the passing seasons, to develop the kind of deep relationship with the land that came only from years of careful observation. Yet Jake also sensed that this way of life was fragile, dependent on a delicate balance between human needs and natural forces. The wolves that roamed the mountains were part of that balance, but they were also increasingly seen as obstacles to progress. More ranches meant more cattle, and more cattle meant less tolerance for predators. It was a conflict as old as civilization itself, the tension between security and freedom, between control and wildness. As he rode into town, Jake touched his hand briefly to the saddle horn, feeling the smooth wood worn by years of use. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as he always had, with the quiet determination of a man who had learned to depend on himself and the simple wisdom of treating all living things with the respect they deserved. It was an approach that had served him well so far, though he couldn't help but wonder if the changing times would continue to allow for such philosophy. The morning was still young, and Jake had work to do, but something in the air, perhaps the way the light fell across the valley, or the unusual silence from the mountains, suggested that this day might be different from the ones that had come before. In a land where small changes could have large consequences, a man learned to pay attention to such feelings. The fence line between Hayes' Circle H Ranch and the open range stretched like a scar across the landscape, marking the boundary between claimed and wild land. Jake had ridden this border many times before, checking for breaks in the wire or signs of rustlers, but this morning something was different. Ranger's ears pricked forward, and the horse's step grew cautious as they approached the main gate that led to Hayes' property. The sound reached Jake before he saw its source, a low whimpering that spoke of fear and pain in equal measure. It was the kind of sound that cut through a man's defenses, regardless of his experience with the harsh realities of frontier life. Jake dismounted and approached the gate with careful steps, his weathered boots silent on the hard-packed earth. There, wedged between the heavy iron bars of Hayes' ornate gate, was a wolf pup no more than 3 months old. The little creature had somehow managed to get its head and one front paw through the decorative metalwork, but the narrowing space had trapped it as securely as any snare. Its dark fur was matted with moisture from its struggles, and its amber eyes held the wild panic of a creature that understood it was going to die. Jake knelt beside the gate, studying the situation with the methodical approach of a man accustomed to solving problems. The pup had wedged itself in thoroughly. Backing out was impossible now, and forcing it forward would likely break bones or worse. The ironwork was solid, designed more for display than function, with curved elements that created the trap. As Jake examined the situation more closely, something glinted in the morning light near the pup's neck. A small silver locket had somehow become tangled in the animal's fur. Its chain caught on one of the iron spikes. The locket was of human manufacture, clearly not something that belonged in the wilderness. Jake reached carefully toward it, and the pup's struggles intensified, though it was too exhausted to do more than whimper. "Easy now," Jake murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used with frightened horses. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The pup's amber eyes fixed on his face, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, or simply the desperate hope of a creature with no other options. Jake had seen that look before, in the eyes of men and animals. Alike, when they faced circumstances beyond their control, he should have walked away. Every instinct born of frontier pragmatism told him to leave the pup to its fate. Wolves were predators, killers of livestock, and threats to the livelihoods that men like Hayes had worked to build. The territorial government had even placed a bounty on wolves, recognizing them as obstacles to civilization's advance. Any rancher in the valley would have considered the trapped pup a piece of good fortune, one less wolf to threaten their herds in the future. But Jake found himself thinking of another trapped creature from years past, a young horse that had fallen into an abandoned mine shaft during his cavalry days. His commanding officer had ordered him to put the animal out of its misery, but Jake had spent 2 days rigging a system of ropes and pulleys to bring the horse to safety. The horse had gone on to serve faithfully for years, as if it understood the debt it owed to the man who had refused to give up on it. The memory made his decision for him. Jake retrieved a set of wire cutters from his saddlebags and began working on the decorative ironwork that held the pup prisoner. The metal was thick and ornate, requiring patience and careful positioning to avoid injuring the animal further. Each cut sent small vibrations through the gate, and the pup flinched with each metallic ping, but gradually the trap began to loosen. As he worked, Jake gently freed the silver locket from the pup's fur and examined it more closely. The chain was fine work, clearly expensive, and the locket itself bore an inscription too small to read in the morning light. Inside, he could see the edge of what appeared to be a photograph. It was an odd thing to find on a wild animal, and Jake tucked it into his vest pocket with the intention of examining it more carefully later. With a final, careful cut, the modified opening was large enough for the pup to withdraw its head. The little wolf pulled back immediately, stumbling and nearly falling in its haste to escape. For a moment it stood 20 feet away, sides heaving with exhaustion and stress, staring at the man who had freed it. Jake remained kneeling by the gate, making no sudden movements. He had learned long ago that frightened animals needed time to process their situation, to understand that the danger had passed. The pup tilted its head, studying him with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its intensity. "Go on now," Jake said softly. "Get back to your family." The pup took another step backward, then another, but it didn't flee. Instead, it continued to watch Jake with those remarkable amber eyes, as if trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, with what seemed almost like reluctance, the young wolf turned and trotted toward the tree line, pausing once to look back before disappearing into the shadows of the pine forest. Jake stood and surveyed his handiwork. The gate now bore obvious signs of his intervention. The cut metal gleamed silver against the darker iron, and pieces of wire lay scattered on the ground. There would be no hiding what he had done, and Hayes would undoubtedly have questions about the damage to his property. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced those questions would come sooner than expected. Samuel Hayes rode up at a pace that suggested urgency, his face already set in the hard lines that Jake had come to associate with the man's displeasure. Behind him rode two of his hands, both armed and alert in the way of men who expected trouble. "Morrison," Hayes said, his voice carrying the chill of a Montana winter. "Mind explaining why my gate looks like it's been through a war?" Jake straightened, his hands hanging loose at his sides in the relaxed posture of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. "Found a wolf pup trapped in the ironwork," he said simply. "Freed it." Hayes dismounted and examined the damaged gate, his expression growing darker with each cut mark he discovered. "You destroyed my property to save a wolf?" The disbelief in his voice was mixed with something harder, more dangerous. "Gate can be repaired," Jake replied. "Couldn't say the same for the pup." "That pup will grow up to kill my cattle," Hayes said, his voice rising slightly. "Every rancher in this valley has lost stock to wolves, and you just guaranteed that we'll lose more." One of Hayes's hands, a lean man named Curtis with cold eyes and quick hands, spoke up. "Mr. Hayes, you want us to track that wolf down? Can't have gone far." Jake's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight settling into the balls of his feet. "The animal's gone," he said quietly. "No need for tracking." Hayes studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if trying to read something there. "This valley's changing, Morrison. Progress demands that we make hard choices about what belongs here and what doesn't. Wolves don't belong among civilized people." "Civilized people don't torture creatures that can't defend themselves," Jake replied, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the conversation was over. The tension stretched between the two men like a taut rope. Hayes's hands flexed near his gun belt, and Curtis took a half-step closer to his employer. But Jake's reputation as a man not easily intimidated had been earned through years of quiet demonstration, and Hayes was pragmatic enough to recognize when pushing might lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. "I'll send you a bill for the gate," Hayes said finally, swinging back into his saddle. "And Morrison, next time you see fit to interfere with matters that don't concern you, remember that good intentions don't always protect a man from the consequences of his actions." As Hayes and his men rode away, Jake remounted Ranger and continued his circuit of the fence line, but his mind was no longer on his work. The encounter had crystallized something that had been building for months, a recognition that the valley was indeed changing, and that the changes would require every man to choose which side of the dividing line he stood on. In his vest pocket, the silver locket seemed to carry an unusual weight, as if it held secrets that might explain more than just how it had come to be tangled in a wolf pup's fur. Jake found himself looking forward to examining it more closely, though he couldn't have said why he felt it might be important. Behind him, the damaged gate stood as evidence of his choice to follow compassion over convenience. Ahead lay whatever consequences that choice might bring. 3 days after the incident at Hayes's gate, Jake first noticed he was being followed. It was nothing obvious, just a feeling that prickled at the back of his neck during his morning rides. The sense of eyes watching from the timberline. Ranger felt it too, his ears constantly swiveling toward the shadows beneath the pine trees. Though the horse showed no signs of alarm, Jake had always possessed what his cavalry sergeant had called woods sense, an intuitive understanding of when the natural order of things had been disturbed. It served him well in tracking strayed cattle or reading weather patterns, and now it told him that something had changed in the rhythm of the wilderness around his small ranch. On the 4th morning, his suspicions were confirmed. As he checked his horses in the corral behind his cabin, a movement caught his eye near the creek that ran along his property's eastern boundary. There, half hidden behind a fallen log, sat the wolf pup he had freed from Hayes's gate. The little wolf was larger than Jake remembered, though still clearly a juvenile. Its coat had dried to reveal a rich grey-black coloration that would make it nearly invisible in forest shadows. Hence the name that came immediately to Jake's mind. Shadow, he murmured to himself, testing how the word felt, as if responding. To his voice, the pup's ears pricked forward, though it made no move to approach. Instead, it seemed content to simply watch, maintaining a distance that spoke of wildness, but also of curiosity. Jake continued his morning routine, speaking softly to his horses and going about his chores, aware all the while of those amber eyes observing his every movement. When Jake finally rode out to check his fence lines, Shadow disappeared back into the forest. But later that evening, as Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and the silver locket he had taken from the wolf's fur, he glimpsed the pup again, this time closer to the cabin, lying beneath an old apple tree that had been planted by the property's previous owner. The locket had proven as mysterious as Jake had suspected. The photograph inside showed a young woman with kind eyes and an infant child, both dressed in clothing that suggested prosperity. The inscription on the back read, "Forever in our hearts, MS." The initials meant nothing to Jake, but something about the woman's face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her. Word of Jake's intervention at the gate had spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that news traveled in small communities. The general store's morning gathering of coffee drinkers had dissected the incident from every angle, and opinions had formed quickly along predictable lines. Most of the established ranchers sided with Hayes, viewing Jake's actions as dangerous sentimentality that threatened their livelihoods. Others, particularly the smaller farmers and townspeople, saw it as an act of simple human decency. The division became clear when Jake rode into town later that week for supplies. Conversation stopped when he entered buildings, and several men, who had previously nodded respectfully, now turned away or found urgent business elsewhere. Jake had expected this reaction, but the reality of it still stung more than he cared to admit. Sheriff Bradley intercepted him outside the general store, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Jake, we need to talk," he said, gesturing toward the shade of the building's overhang. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the afternoon activity on Main Street. Finally, Bradley spoke. "Hayes has been making noise about your wolf incident. Says you're interfering with legitimate business and encouraging dangerous wildlife." "Wolf's not dangerous," Jake replied. "It's barely weaned. You and I know that," Bradley said. "But Hayes is good at making people see things his way." He's got the ear of some influential folks, and he's suggesting that maybe you've got a few screws loose from your cavalry days. Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling that had plagued him for months after he'd left military service. There had been times when he'd wondered about his own mental state, particularly in the dark months following his discharge, when sleep came hard and memories came too easily. "Tom," Jake said quietly, "you know me well enough to judge whether I'm a danger to anybody." Bradley nodded slowly. "I do, but I'm not the one you need to convince. Hayes has called. A meeting for tomorrow night at the town hall. Says he wants to discuss community safety concerns. You might want to think about attending." Before Jake could respond, a soft voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, gentlemen." They turned to see Maria Santos approaching, carrying a basket of herbs and wearing the practical dress of a woman who worked with her hands. Maria was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a doctor, though she had no formal training. Her knowledge of healing came from her grandmother, who had learned from the indigenous people of the region before the territory was officially settled. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see more than most people revealed. "Sheriff Bradley, Mr. Morrison," she said with a slight nod to each man. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you. Thank me." Jake was genuinely puzzled for showing compassion to a helpless creature. "In my experience, how a person treats those who cannot defend themselves reveals more about their character than any amount of social standing or wealth." Her eyes held Jake's for a moment longer than mere politeness required. "I hope you won't let others discourage such kindness." She moved past them into the store, leaving Jake with the distinct impression that she had said exactly what she meant to say. Bradley watched her go with an expression that suggested he was reassessing the situation. "Interesting," the sheriff murmured. "Maria Santos doesn't often speak up in public like that. Her grandmother was well respected in these parts. Some say she had a way with animals that bordered on mystical." That evening, Jake sat on his porch as the sun set behind the mountains, whittling a piece of pine he had picked up during his ride. The wood was soft and straight-grained, perfect for his purposes. His grandfather had taught him woodworking during long winter evenings, and Jake had found that working with his hands helped calm his mind when circumstances grew complex. Shadow appeared as the last light faded, moving like liquid darkness from the forest to take up his position beneath the apple tree. Jake continued whittling, shaping the wood into a simple whistle. Nothing fancy, just a hollow tube with finger, holes that would produce a clear, carrying tone. When he finished, Jake tested the whistle softly, producing a low, melodious note that seemed to harmonize with the evening sounds of crickets and settling birds. Shadow's ears pricked at the sound, and the pup lifted his head with unmistakable interest. Jake played another note, then another, creating a simple melody that his grandfather had taught him years ago. To his amazement, Shadow rose from his resting place and took several steps closer, stopping just at the edge of the porch light's reach. "Well, I'll be," Jake murmured, lowering the whistle. "You like music, do you?" Shadow tilted his head, studying Jake with that unsettling intelligence. When Jake played another soft phrase, the pup came closer still, eventually settling on the ground just 10 feet from the porch steps. They remained like that as full darkness fell, man and wolf connected by something simpler and more profound than either fear or dominance. Jake understood then that his decision at Hayes's Gate had set in motion something larger than he had anticipated. Shadow was not just a wild animal he had helped. The pup was becoming something more complex, a bridge between Jake's solitary world and forces he was only beginning to understand. As he prepared to go inside for the night, Jake played one final, gentle melody on his newly carved whistle. Shadow's ears followed every note, and when the music stopped, the wolf let out a soft sound. Not quite a howl, but something that seemed to echo the whistle's tone. Tomorrow would bring the town meeting and whatever consequences Hayes had planned. But tonight, Jake felt a strange peace settling over him, as if he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. The town meeting had gone exactly as Jake had expected. Poorly. Hayes had painted him as a danger to the community, a man whose questionable judgment and possible mental instability made him unfit to participate in decisions affecting everyone's safety. Several ranchers had spoken in support of Hayes's position, citing their own losses to wolf predation and questioning Jake's loyalty to his neighbors. Jake had said little in his own defense, understanding that words would not change minds already made up. When pressed to explain his actions, he had simply stated that he believed in treating all creatures with basic decency, a position that had drawn snorts of derision from some quarters and thoughtful nods from others. The result had been a formal resolution passed by a narrow margin, declaring wolves a threat to community welfare and authorizing bounties for their elimination. Jake had voted against the measure, along with Sheriff Bradley and a handful of others, but the outcome had been predetermined. Now, 3 days later, Jake was beginning to understand the true cost of standing apart from community sentiment. His usual customers for horse training had found excuses to take their business elsewhere. The blacksmith had informed him that repairs to his equipment would face indefinite delays due to a sudden influx of priority work from other customers. Even the simple act of buying supplies had become an exercise in enduring hostile stares and whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. It was against this backdrop of social isolation that Jake discovered Shadow injured on the 4th morning after the meeting. The wolf pup lay beneath the apple tree in an awkward position, favoring his left rear leg and panting in the shallow, rapid way that animals breathed when pain overwhelmed their natural stoicism. Jake approached slowly, speaking in the same gentle tones he had used during their evening musical sessions. Shadow's ears tracked his movement, but the pup made no attempt to flee, suggesting that the injury was serious enough to override natural caution. A closer examination revealed deep claw marks across Shadow's flank and hindquarter, the unmistakable signature of a bear attack. The wounds were fresh, but not bleeding heavily, indicating they were perhaps a day old. Shadow had somehow managed to escape whatever encounter had caused the damage, but infection was a real possibility if the injuries weren't properly cleaned and treated. Jake faced a difficult choice. Bringing Shadow to town for Maria Santos's expert medical attention would provide the best chance for the wolf's recovery, but it would also expose Jake to further accusations of dangerous behavior. Treating the animal himself carried the risk of inadequate care that might lead to Shadow's death. The decision made itself when Shadow attempted to stand and nearly collapsed from pain. Jake wrapped the wolf carefully in an old horse blanket, surprised by how little resistance the animal offered. Shadow seemed to understand that Jake meant to help, and submitted to being carried with the trust of a creature that had learned to distinguish between friend and foe. The ride to town drew attention immediately. Jake could feel eyes following his progress down Main Street, and by the time he reached Maria's small clinic behind the general store, a small crowd had gathered. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to outright hostility, with several men muttering about Jake's unhealthy obsession with dangerous wildlife. Maria emerged from her clinic before Jake could dismount, her face showing no surprise at his arrival with an injured wolf. "Bring him inside," she said simply, holding the door open and ignoring the shocked protests from the gathering crowd. Her clinic was a model of practical efficiency, clean, well-organized, and equipped with an impressive array of herbs, instruments, and medical supplies. Maria examined Shadow with the same professional thoroughness she would have shown a human patient, her hands gentle but sure, as she assessed the extent of the injuries. "Bear," she confirmed after a few minutes. "Probably a sow with cubs, judging by the spacing of the claw marks. The wounds are clean, which is fortunate. Bears have dirty claws that often cause infection." As Maria began cleaning the wounds with a solution that smelled strongly of pine and alcohol, Shadow whimpered softly, but made no attempt to bite or escape. Jake found himself impressed by the wolf's apparent understanding that these strangers were trying to help rather than harm. "He trusts you," Maria observed, glancing at Jake as she worked. "Wild animals don't usually show this level of acceptance toward humans unless they've learned to associate them with safety rather than threat." Jake removed his red bandana, a piece of cloth that had served him faithfully for years, and handed it to Maria as she prepared to bandage the worst of the wounds. The bandana quickly became stained with blood and antiseptic, but it served its purpose in protecting the injuries from dirt and infection. "This will create more problems for you in town," Maria said as she finished her work. "People are already talking about your association with this animal." "People will talk regardless," Jake replied. "At least this way I can sleep knowing I did what was right." Maria studied his face for a moment before nodding. "My grandmother always said that a person's character is revealed not by how they treat their equals, but by how they treat those who are powerless. I think she would have approved of your choice." Outside the clinic, the crowd had grown larger and more vocal. Jake could hear Hayes's voice rising above the others, demanding to know why the town's medical resources were being wasted on a dangerous predator. The anger in the voices suggested that patience for Jake's unconventional behavior was wearing thin. As if sensing the tension outside, Shadow struggled to his feet, clearly intending to leave despite his injuries. Jake knelt beside the examination table and spoke softly to the wolf, using the same tones that had calmed him during their evening encounters. "Easy, boy. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Shadow's amber eyes fixed on Jake's face, and gradually the tension left the wolf's body. He settled back onto the table with what seemed almost like a sigh of resignation, trusting Jake to handle whatever dangers waited outside. The moment of trust was not lost on Maria, who watched the interaction with growing understanding. "How long has he been following you?" she asked. "Since the day I freed him from Hayes's gate. Shows up every evening, listens when I play the whistle, then disappears back into the forest come morning." Maria's expression grew thoughtful. "My grandmother told stories about such bonds, partnerships between humans and wild animals that went beyond normal understanding. She said they were rare, but when they occurred, they usually meant that both human and animal had something important to learn from each other." Before Jake could respond to this intriguing observation, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the clinic's small window, they could see Sheriff Bradley attempting to calm the crowd, while Hayes gestured angrily toward the building. "I should go," Jake said, preparing to carry Shadow back outside. "Wait," Maria said, moving to a cabinet and retrieving a small cloth bag. "Willow bark powder mixed with chamomile. Add a pinch to his water each day until the wounds heal. And Jake—" She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "Don't let them make you doubt what you know to be right." As Jake carried Shadow back outside, the crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile. Several men demanded that the wolf be destroyed on the spot, claiming it represented a clear danger to the community. Hayes stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This has gone far enough, Morrison," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That animal belongs in the wild, not being coddled like a pet. You're setting a dangerous precedent that could get people killed." Jake settled Shadow gently into the makeshift sling he had rigged on his saddle, then turned to face the crowd. The faces looking back at him showed varying degrees of anger, fear, and disapproval, with only a few expressions of sympathy or understanding. "Animals injured and needed help," Jake said simply. "Same as any creature would." "That creature would kill your horses given half a chance," Hayes shot back. "Mark my words, Morrison, this foolishness will come back to haunt you." As Jake rode slowly out of town, he could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. The social isolation that had begun with the town meeting was now complete. He had crossed a line from which there might be no return, choosing loyalty to a wild animal over acceptance by his human community. That evening, as Shadow rested comfortably in Jake's barn with his wounds properly dressed, Jake sat on his porch and considered the price of his choices. The blood-stained bandana lay on the table beside him, a tangible reminder of the day's events. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Jake suspected that Hayes was far from finished with his campaign, to force a choice between wolves and civilization. But as he played a gentle melody on his carved whistle and watched Shadow's ears prick, with interest despite his injuries, Jake found himself oddly at peace with the path he had chosen. Shadow's recovery progressed faster than Jake had dared hope. Within a week, the wolf was moving freely around the ranch, though he continued to avoid the barn where Jake's horses were stabled. The wisdom of this caution became clear 2 nights after the clinic incident, when the mountain lion struck. Jake woke to the sound of horses screaming, a sound that brought him instantly alert with the cold clarity that came from years of living where dangerous wildlife was a constant threat. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the corral, his bare feet finding their way in the darkness through long familiarity with his property's layout. The scene that greeted him defied immediate comprehension. A large mountain lion had somehow gotten into the corral and was stalking his prized mare, Duchess, who was backed against the far rail with terror in her rolling eyes. But between the predator and the horse stood Shadow, his hackles raised and his body language radiating a determination that seemed far too large for his still juvenile frame. The mountain lion was easily 3 times Shadow's size, with the heavy, muscle and killing claws that made it one of the forest's apex predators. By any rational measure, the young wolf should have fled rather than challenge such a formidable opponent. Instead, Shadow held his ground, growling with a sound that carried echoes of his wild heritage despite his youth. Jake raised his rifle, seeking a clear shot that wouldn't endanger either Shadow or his horses. But before he could fire, Shadow launched himself at the mountain lion with a speed and ferocity that took even Jake by surprise. The 2 animals rolled together in a snarling ball of fur and claws, the lion's superior size offset by Shadow's desperate courage and surprising agility. The fight lasted only moments, but they were moments that seemed frozen in time. Shadow managed to lock his jaws on the lion's front leg, eliciting a scream of pain and rage from the larger predator. The lion twisted and raked its claws across Shadow's side, but the wolf held on with grim determination. Jake found his shot and took it, the rifle's crack echoing across the valley like thunder. The mountain lion dropped instantly, its threat ended by a well-placed bullet behind the shoulder. Shadow released his grip and staggered backward, his sides heaving with exhaustion and adrenaline. In the sudden silence that followed, Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Duchess and his other 2 horses stood pressed against the far rail, snorting and stamping with nervous energy, but clearly unharmed. Shadow sat in the middle of the corral, tongue lolling as he panted, looking for all the world like a ranch dog that had just performed a particularly impressive trick. Jake entered the corral carefully, speaking in soothing tones to calm his horses while keeping one eye on Shadow. The wolf's new wounds appeared superficial, scratches that would heal cleanly, but Jake marveled at the courage the young animal had shown in defending creatures that should have been his natural prey. As he examined the scene more carefully, Jake noticed something that made him pause. The mountain lion had entered the corral by clawing through the rope that secured the gate latch. The heavy hemp rope, designed to withstand the pulling power of horses, had been shredded like twine by the big cat's claws. A length of the frayed rope lay near the gate, its twisted fibers telling the story of how close disaster had come to his small ranch. But for Shadow's intervention, Jake might have lost all 3 horses, animals that represented not just his livelihood, but his connection to a way of life he valued above social acceptance. The financial loss would have been devastating, but the emotional cost would have been even higher. The sound of approaching riders interrupted his thoughts. Sheriff Bradley arrived first, followed by 3 of Hayes's men who had apparently heard the rifle shot and come to investigate. Their expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed satisfaction as if they had expected Jake's association with wolves to lead to exactly this kind of trouble. "Everyone all right here, Jake?" Bradley asked, dismounting and examining a dead mountain lion with professional interest. "Fine now," Jake replied, gesturing toward Shadow. "Wolf warned me and drove off the cat before it could kill my horses." Curtis, Hayes's foreman, spat into the dirt with obvious contempt. "More likely that Wolf led the cat here in the first place. Mountain lions follow wolf scent. Everybody knows that." Jake felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "Lion came through the gate rope, not over the fence. Been hunting alone, not following any pack." "Convenient story," Curtis replied. "Real convenient that your pet wolf just happened to be here when trouble struck." Bradley knelt beside the mountain lion's carcass, examining the wounds and the surrounding evidence, with the methodical approach of a man who had investigated many such incidents. "This cat's been hunting cattle," he announced after a few minutes. "Look at the belly, fresh beef and recent, probably one of Hayes's missing steers." The information seemed to deflate some of Curtis's hostility, but he remained skeptical. "Still don't explain why Morrison's wolf was here instead of running like any sensible animal would." Jake looked at Shadow, who had moved to a position near the barn, where he could observe the proceedings without being directly threatened by the strangers. The wolf's amber eyes held an alertness that seemed almost human in its intensity, as if he understood that his presence was the subject of debate. "Maybe some animals choose protection over self-preservation," Jake said quietly. "Maybe loyalty means something in the wild, too." The comment drew snorts of derision from Hayes's men, but Bradley nodded thoughtfully. As a lawman, he had learned to read situations that didn't always fit conventional explanations, and Jake's reputation for honesty carried weight with him. After the visitors left, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and the frayed rope from his gate. The hemp fibers were stained with the mountain lion's saliva and torn in the distinctive pattern of claws designed for killing. Without Shadow's intervention, he would have awakened to find his horses dead and his livelihood destroyed. But even as gratitude filled his heart, doubt began to creep in around the edges. Curtis's suggestion that the wolf might have attracted the mountain lion wasn't entirely without merit. Predators did sometimes follow each other's scent trails, and Jake had to admit that Shadow's presence might have contributed to the danger as much as it had resolved it. The social pressure was taking its toll as well. Jake's isolation from the community had deepened since the clinic incident, and he found himself questioning not just his judgment about Shadow, but his ability to function effectively in a world that demanded conformity to shared values. Perhaps Hayes and the others were right. Perhaps his attachment to a wild animal was a sign of deteriorating mental stability. These doubts were reinforced the following evening when Shadow failed to appear for their usual musical session. Jake played his carved whistle hopefully, sending the familiar melodies into the darkness, but received no response. He told himself that the wolf was simply recovering from his injuries, or had finally returned to his natural place in the wild. But a growing sense of loss accompanied the rationalization. On the third night of Shadow's absence, Jake's concerns took on a more ominous character. Strange howls echoed from the mountains, not the occasional calls he was accustomed to hearing, but the coordinated vocalizations of a large pack establishing territorial boundaries. The sounds were closer than usual, suggesting that the local wolf population was responding to some kind of disruption in their normal patterns. Jake found himself lying awake, listening to the wild symphony and wondering if Shadow had rejoined his birth pack or if something more serious was developing in the wilderness around his ranch. The young wolf's absence felt like an abandonment, reinforcing his growing sense that his choices had been misguided and his instincts flawed. When Hayes rode up to his cabin the next morning, Jake was almost relieved to have human company, regardless of the man's obvious hostility. Hayes's expression was grimmer than usual, and he carried himself with the tense alertness of a man bearing serious news. "Morrison," Hayes said without preamble, "we need to talk. My cattle are being hit hard by wolves. Lost 6 head in the past 3 days. The pack that's doing it is larger and more aggressive than anything we've seen in years. Jake poured himself a cup of coffee and waited for Hayes to continue, sensing that there was more to this visit than a simple report of livestock losses. Word is that your pet wolf has rejoined his family, Hayes continued, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Word is also that wolves learn human scent and behavior from contact with people like you, makes them bolder, more willing to approach ranches and farms. The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. If Shadow had indeed taught other wolves to associate humans with safety rather than danger, then Jake's compassion might have created a threat larger than anything his individual kindness could justify. Hayes's words echoed in Jake's mind long after the rancher had ridden away, leaving behind ultimatums and barely veiled threats. The community's patience was exhausted, Hayes had said. Either Jake would distance himself from the wolves or face consequences that extended beyond social isolation. Other ranchers from neighboring valleys were getting involved, men with resources and influence that could make Jake's life very difficult indeed. That evening, Jake found himself in his cabin, staring at a worn leather journal he hadn't opened in 3 years. The book contained his private thoughts from the darkest period of his life, the months following his discharge from the cavalry, when he had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. His hand trembled slightly. As he opened to a page he had read many times, but never shared with another living soul. The entry was dated September 15th, 1881, written in his own careful script, but bearing the emotional weight of a man wrestling with grief and guilt. Today marks 6 months since I lost Tommy, 6 months since I failed in the most important duty a father can have. Maria says I must stop blaming myself, that what happened was God's will or fate or some other explanation that's supposed to bring comfort. But I know the truth. If I had been a better father, if I had paid more attention to his wandering nature, if I had taught him better about the dangers that lurk in wild places, my son would still be alive. Jake's finger traced the words on the page, feeling again the raw anguish that had nearly destroyed him after Tommy's death. His 5-year-old son had wandered away from their cabin while Jake was working in the barn, drawn by the adventure of exploring the forest that surrounded their homestead. The search had lasted 3 days, involving every able-bodied man in the territory, but they had found only torn clothing and wolf tracks near the creek, where Tommy had apparently stopped to drink. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that his current situation involved protecting the very creatures that had taken his child. But the years had taught him that hatred was a poison that hurt the one who carried it more than the target of the emotion. Tommy's death had been a tragedy, but it had also been part of the harsh reality of frontier life where wild animals and human settlements existed in constant tension. Jake turned the page and read another entry, this one written weeks later. Sheriff Bradley says I should consider moving to town, that living alone out here isn't healthy for a man in my condition. He means well, but he doesn't understand that being around people right now feels like wearing clothes that don't fit. Everyone wants to offer comfort or advice, or their theories about God's plan, and I find myself wanting to scream that there is no plan, no meaning, just random cruelty that takes innocent children and leaves broken fathers to pretend that life. It goes on normally. The page was stained with what might have been tears or whiskey or both. Jake couldn't remember the details of that particular night, though he remembered the pain with perfect clarity. Below the entry, someone had torn away the bottom third of the page, probably during one of his darker moments when destroying reminders of his loss had seemed like the only way to stop the constant ache in his chest. A sound from outside interrupted his brooding. Shadow had returned, settling into his usual position beneath the apple tree, though something in his posture suggested wariness. Jake closed the journal and stepped onto the porch, noting immediately that the wolf was not alone. 3 adult wolves emerged from the tree line, moving with the fluid coordination of a pack that had hunted together for years. They were magnificent animals, larger and more powerfully built than Shadow, with the confident bearing of creatures that knew themselves to be apex predators. Their eyes reflected the porch light with an unsettling intelligence as they studied the human who had formed an unlikely bond with one of their own. Jake remained motionless, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might trigger an attack. These were not the half-tame creatures of childhood stories, but wild animals operating according to their own complex social codes. Shadow rose from his position and moved toward the pack, his body language shifting from relaxation to alert submission as he acknowledged the presence of his elders. The largest wolf, clearly the pack's alpha, fixed Jake with a stare that seemed to look straight through him. For a long moment, man and wolf regarded each other across the space that separated domestic life from wilderness. Then, with what seemed almost like a nod of acknowledgement, the alpha turned and melted back into the forest, followed by the other. Adults. Shadow hesitated at the edge of the clearing, looking back at Jake with an expression that might have been regret or apology. Then he too disappeared into the darkness, leaving Jake alone with the realization that the young wolf had been called back to his true family. The next morning brought Sheriff Bradley with news that Jake had been expecting but dreading. Hayes has organized a coalition, Bradley announced without preamble. Ranchers from 3 counties, all of them ready to take action against what they're calling the wolf problem. They're planning a coordinated hunt, and Jake, they're starting with your property. Jake poured coffee for both men and settled into the chair across from Bradley. When? Day after tomorrow. Hayes has convinced them that your land is the center of pack activity, that eliminating the wolves here will solve the problem for everybody. Bradley's expression was troubled. I can't stop them legally. They have permission from the territorial government and the support of local landowners. But I wanted to warn you. Appreciated, Jake said quietly. What about Shadow? Bradley's face grew even more serious. Jake, you need to understand something. Whatever connection you feel to that animal, the men coming here won't make distinctions between wolves that have shown friendly behavior and those that haven't. To them, a wolf is a wolf. The words struck Jake like physical blows. He had known, intellectually, that his protection of Shadow couldn't last indefinitely. But hearing the reality, stated so bluntly, forced him to confront choices he had been avoiding. There's something else, Bradley continued reluctantly. Hayes has been asking questions about your time in the cavalry, suggesting that maybe the stress of military service affected your judgment. He's even brought up Tommy's death, implying that your current behavior is some kind of delayed reaction to that tragedy. Jake felt anger rise in his chest, not just at Hayes's manipulation of his personal loss, but at the man's willingness to weaponize grief for political purposes. What I do on my own land is my business, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I agree, Bradley replied. But Jake, you need to think about whether fighting this battle is worth the cost. Hayes isn't just talking about wolves anymore. He's talking about your fitness to remain in this community. After Bradley left, Jake spent the day wrestling with the impossible choice between protecting Shadow and preserving his own place in the world he had built after Tommy's death. The torn page from his journal lay on the table, a reminder of how completely grief had once consumed him, and how long it had taken to rebuild some semblance of a meaningful life. That evening, as if sensing the crisis, Shadow returned alone. The young wolf approached closer than ever before, eventually settling on the porch steps just a few feet from Jake's chair. His amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Jake reached out slowly, and for the first time touched Shadow's head. The wolf's fur was coarser than he had expected, and beneath it he could feel the solid bone and muscle of a creature designed for survival in harsh conditions. Shadow leaned into the touch slightly, a gesture of trust that broke something loose in Jake's carefully guarded heart. I don't know how to protect you, Jake whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to choose between what's right and what's safe." Shadow's only response was to rest his chin on his paws and settle in for the night, as if to say that some decisions were too important to be made alone. As Jake sat in the gathering darkness, he found himself thinking not of the hunters who would arrive in 2 days, but of his son Tommy, and the courage it might take to honor both the living and the dead. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos arrived at Jake's cabin before dawn, her horse lathered with sweat and her face tight with urgency. She carried a canvas bag that clinked with the weight of metal objects, and her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled anger. "We need to examine that locket again," she said without preamble, dismounting and securing her horse with quick, efficient movements. "The one you found on Shadow when you freed him from the gate." Jake retrieved the silver locket from his cabin, still puzzled by its presence on a wild animal, but no closer to understanding its significance. Maria opened it carefully and removed the small photograph, holding it up to catch the first rays of morning light. "I thought I recognized her," Maria said, pointing to the woman in the image. "This is Rebecca Hayes, Samuel's wife. She died in a riding accident 3 years ago, along with their infant son." The information hit Jake like a physical blow. He stared at the photograph with new understanding, seeing now the resemblance between the woman's features and those of Samuel Hayes, but the implications raised more questions than they answered. "How did Hayes's family locket end up on Shadow?" Jake asked. Maria's expression grew even more grim. "That's what I've been investigating. Jake, there was no riding accident. Rebecca Hayes was murdered, along with her child, and Samuel has been covering it up ever since." She opened her canvas bag and began removing items, surveying equipment, official-looking documents with territorial government seals, and what appeared to be geological samples. "My grandmother left me more than just knowledge of healing herbs," Maria explained. "She also left me a claim to a small plot of land in the mountains, land that happens to border your property." Jake examined the documents Maria spread on his porch table. They were mining surveys, territorial land office records, and geological assessments that painted a picture he had never suspected. According to the official paperwork, the mountains surrounding Cedar Ridge contained significant silver deposits, with the richest veins running directly beneath his modest ranch and extending into the unclaimed territory where Shadow's pack had established its territory. "Hayes discovered this 3 years ago," Maria continued, her voice growing harder. "He hired a private geological survey, thinking he could quietly buy up the mineral rights to the entire area. But there was a problem. Your land sits right on top of the main vein, and you've shown no interest in selling." The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place in Jake's mind. Hayes's sudden interest in wolf predation, the convenient timing of pack attacks on his cattle, the organized campaign to paint Jake as a danger to the community. All of it took on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of mineral wealth and land acquisition. "Rebecca found out about her husband's plans," Maria said softly. "She discovered that he intended to use any means necessary to force you and other small landowners to sell. When she threatened to expose him, Hayes killed her and made it look like an accident." Jake studied the photograph again, seeing now not just the face of a young mother, but the expression of someone who had learned something terrible about the person she trusted most. "How do you know all this?" Maria's hand moved to a leather pouch at her belt, removing a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a larger document. "Because Rebecca Hayes came to me the night before she died. She was terrified, not for herself but for her child. She had discovered evidence of her husband's crimes and was planning to take it to the territorial authorities." The paper Maria handed Jake was a fragment of a hand-drawn map showing mineral deposits and property boundaries in careful detail. In one corner, written in a woman's careful script, were the words, "For the sheriff," proof of Samuel's lies about the mining claims. "She never made it to Sheriff Bradley," Maria continued. Her horse was found the next morning at the bottom of Miller's Canyon, but the saddle had been cut loose and the bridle showed knife marks. Hayes claimed she must have been thrown during a storm, but I examined the scene myself. It was murder. Jake felt a cold fury building in his chest as the full scope of Hayes's deception became clear. The wolf attacks, manufactured, Maria confirmed. Hayes has been using hunters to drive the local pack closer to ranches, then claiming increased predation. He's even been killing his own cattle and blaming it on wolves to build support for elimination of the pack and anyone who might protect them. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Shadow appeared from the tree line, his posture alert and warning, followed immediately by the sight of Hayes and 6 armed men riding up the valley toward Jake's cabin. They moved with the purposeful formation of a military unit, suggesting that this was not a social visit. "Get inside," Jake told Maria, but she shook her head. "No, this ends now. I have evidence that can destroy Hayes's plans and expose him for what he really is." Hayes reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch, his men spreading out in a semicircle that effectively surrounded the cabin. His face showed none of the false civility he usually employed, only the cold calculation of a man who had committed murder and was prepared to do so again. "Morrison," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Time to settle this wolf problem once and for all. You're going to help us track down that pack and eliminate them, or you're going to find yourself facing charges of interfering with lawful livestock protection." Jake stepped to the edge of the porch, noting the positions of Hayes's men and calculating his chances if the situation turned violent. "What charges would those be, Hayes?" "Harboring dangerous wildlife, interfering with legal predator control." Hayes's eyes fell on Maria, standing beside Jake. "Conspiracy to endanger public safety." Maria stepped forward, holding up the torn map and the mining surveys. "The only conspiracy here is yours, Samuel. Conspiracy to commit fraud, theft, and murder." Hayes's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about, woman. I know that you killed your wife because she discovered your plan to steal mineral rights through false wolf attacks," Maria replied, her voice carrying clearly to all of Hayes's men. "I know that you've been manufacturing evidence of wolf predation to force small landowners to sell their property for a fraction of its real value." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Hayes's men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having been told the full scope of their employer's activities. Several of them began to look uncomfortable with their positions, hands moving away from their weapons as they reassessed the situation. But Hayes himself was beyond rational thought. His hand dropped to his gun, his face twisted with the fury of a man whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. "That's enough," he snarled. "You're both going to have an unfortunate accident, just like my dear departed wife." The admission of guilt was all Jake needed. He dove sideways, carrying Maria with him as Hayes's gun cleared leather. The shot went wide, splintering the cabin's doorframe where they had been standing. What happened next defied every expectation Jake had formed about wolf behavior. Shadow didn't flee from the gunfire. Instead, he launched himself at Hayes with a speed and precision that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal instinct. The wolf's timing was perfect, striking just as Hayes tried to reacquire his target, sending both man and horse tumbling in a confusion of hooves and snarling fury. But Shadow wasn't acting alone. The adult wolves Jake had seen the night before emerged from positions around the cabin, moving with coordinated precision that suggested they had been planning this confrontation. They had been watching, waiting, and protecting, not just Shadow, but Jake himself. Hayes's men found themselves facing not just an angry rancher and a determined woman, but a pack of wolves that seemed to understand exactly who the real threat was. The horses shied and reared, making accurate shooting impossible, while the wolves used the chaos to position themselves strategically around the clearing. Through the mayhem, Jake heard Shadow's distinctive howl, not the random vocalization of a frightened animal, but a deliberate signal that brought immediate response from his pack. The young wolf wasn't just intelligent. He was a leader, directing his family in defense of the human who had shown him kindness. In that moment, Jake understood that everything he thought he knew about wolves, about intelligence, and about the relationship between civilization and wilderness had been fundamentally wrong. Shadow hadn't just learned to trust humans, he had learned to read them, to distinguish between those who meant harm and those who could be allies. The battle was over before it really began. Faced with wolves that fought with tactical awareness and horses that refused to stand steady, Hayes's men quickly lost their appetite for conflict. Two of them threw down their weapons entirely and rode away, unwilling to participate in what was clearly attempted murder rather than lawful predator control. Hayes himself lay on the ground, his right arm clearly broken and his gun lost in the struggle. Shadow stood over him, growling with controlled fury, while the other wolves maintained a perimeter that kept the remaining men from attempting rescue. As Sheriff Bradley arrived with deputies summoned by the gunshots, Jake realized that the silver locket hadn't ended up on Shadow by accident. The young wolf had found it at the scene of Rebecca Hayes's murder and had carried it with him ever since, perhaps understanding instinctively that it was evidence of a crime, or perhaps simply drawn to the scent of someone who had shown him kindness before her death. The truth was more complex and more hopeful than Jake had dared imagine. In a world where greed and violence seemed to dominate, there was still room for intelligence, loyalty, and justice, even when it came from the most unexpected sources. The arrest of Samuel Hayes should have ended the conflict, but instead it only deepened the divisions that had been growing in Cedar Ridge for weeks. Despite the evidence Maria had presented, the mining surveys, the map fragment, and Hayes's own admission of guilt, a significant portion of the community remained convinced that the real problem was wolves, not men who killed for profit. Hayes's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Helena who specialized in territorial land disputes, arrived within 2 days and immediately began spreading doubt about the charges. He suggested that the evidence had been fabricated, that Hayes's confession had been coerced, and that the real conspiracy involved outside interests trying to prevent legitimate development of the region's mineral resources. More troubling still, some of Hayes's men had escaped during the confrontation at Jake's cabin, and they had carried word to ranchers in neighboring counties about the trained wolf pack that was supposedly under Jake's control. The story grew in the telling, transforming from an account of wolves defending themselves into a tale of a mad hermit who had somehow turned wild predators into weapons against civilized society. Jake learned the extent of the spreading hysteria when Sheriff Bradley visited his cabin 3 days after Hayes's arrest. The lawman's face bore the strain of a man trying to hold together a community that was coming apart at the seams. "There's going to be a territorial hearing," Bradley announced without preamble. "Helena is sending investigators to determine whether you pose a threat to public safety. Jake, they're talking about having you committed to an asylum." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He had survived military service, the death of his son, and years of solitary struggle to build a meaningful life, only to face the possibility of being declared insane for showing compassion to a wild animal. "What about the evidence against Hayes?" Jake asked. Bradley's expression grew even more troubled. "His lawyer is claiming that Hayes was acting in self-defense when he made those statements, that you and Maria had threatened him with violence. Without additional witnesses, it becomes your word against his." Jake walked to the window and gazed out at the mountains where Shadow and his pack had taken refuge since the confrontation. The wolves had vanished into the high country, but Jake knew they were still there, watching and waiting for some signal that it was safe to return. "There's more," Bradley continued reluctantly. Hayes's escape has organized a hunting party, 20 men from 3 counties, all armed, and all convinced that eliminating the wolf pack will solve everyone's problems. They're planning to sweep through this entire valley, and Jake, they're not planning to take prisoners. The implications were clear. Hayes might be in jail, but his influence and his money had created a momentum that would be difficult to stop. The hunting party wouldn't distinguish between Shadow and the other wolves, nor would they be particularly concerned about Jake's safety if he got in their way. That evening, Jake found himself in his cabin, holding an object he hadn't touched in years. His father's cavalry saber. The weapon had been passed down through 3 generations of Morrison men, each of whom had used it in service to causes they believed were just. Jake's grandfather had carried it during the Mexican War. His father had wielded it in the Civil War, and Jake himself had worn it during his cavalry service in the Indian campaigns. The saber was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. Its steel, blade engraved with his family's motto, "Honor above all." The brass guard showed the patina of age and use, and the leather grip had been worn smooth by the hands of men who had faced impossible odds and chosen to stand rather than retreat. Jake had put the weapon away after Tommy's death, unable to bear the weight of family tradition when his own life seemed to have fallen apart. But now, as he faced the possibility of losing everything he had rebuilt, the saber felt like a connection to something larger than his individual struggles. A soft sound from outside drew his attention. Shadow had returned, approaching the cabin, with the cautious movements of an animal that understood danger but refused to abandon those it cared about. Behind him, barely visible in the gathering darkness, Jake could see the shapes of the other wolves, the entire pack, risking exposure to offer whatever protection they could provide. Jake stepped onto the porch, the cavalry saber in his hand, catching the last light of evening. Shadow's amber eyes fixed on the weapon, and for a moment Jake wondered if the wolf could sense the history it carried. The tradition of men who had chosen principle over safety. "You should run," Jake said softly, his words carrying across the clearing to where the pack waited. "Take your family and go deep into the mountains where men can't follow." Shadow's response was to move closer, eventually settling on the porch. Steps in the same position he had occupied during their evening musical sessions. The other wolves emerged from the shadows and arranged themselves around the cabin in a protective formation that spoke of loyalty transcending species. Jake understood then that the choice was no longer his alone to make. Shadow and his pack had committed themselves to this conflict, and their presence transformed what might have been a solitary last stand into something approaching hope. Maria arrived as full darkness fell, riding hard and carrying news that Jake had been expecting, but dreading. "The hunting party is moving at first light," she announced, dismounting and securing her horse with practiced efficiency. "Curtis is leading them. Hayes managed to get word out from jail, and his men are determined to finish what they started." Jake nodded, unsurprised by the information. Curtis had always been Hayes's most loyal follower, and the foreman possessed both the tactical knowledge and the ruthless determination necessary to organize an effective hunt. "How many?" Jake asked. 23 men, according to my sources. In town, all armed, some with military experience. They're not just planning to hunt wolves, Jake. They're planning to eliminate anyone who stands in their way. The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake found himself thinking of his father, who had carried the family saber through battles where retreat would have meant safety, but victory required standing firm against overwhelming odds. "I won't run," Jake said quietly. "This is my land. Shadow is under my protection, and I've already lost too much to fear." Maria's expression showed no surprise at his decision, though her eyes reflected deep concern. "Then we make our stand here. But Jake, we need to be smart about this. Curtis knows how to organize a hunt, and he has more men and firepower than we can match in a direct confrontation. They spent the next hours developing a plan that played to their advantages while minimizing their exposure to superior numbers. Jake's knowledge of the local terrain would be crucial, as would Shadow's ability to coordinate with his pack in ways that might confuse and divide the hunting party. But as they planned, Jake found his thoughts returning to the deeper questions that had haunted him since Tommy's death. Was he fighting for Shadow and the wolves? Or was he fighting for something larger, the principle that compassion and understanding should triumph over fear and greed? Was this about animals and land? Or was it about the kind of man he chose to be in the face of impossible circumstances? Sheriff Bradley arrived near midnight, his presence both welcome and troubling. As the law in Cedar Ridge, he should have been committed to stopping the hunting party, but Jake could see the conflict in the man's face, the recognition that legal authority meant little when it conflicted with community sentiment and territorial politics. "I can't officially help you," Bradley said, his words careful and measured, "but I can't officially stop you either. As far as the territorial government is concerned, this is a local matter to be resolved by local interests." Jake understood the subtext. Bradley was giving him permission to defend himself while maintaining the legal fiction that law enforcement was neutral in the conflict. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but might prevent the situation from escalating beyond all control. "There's something else," Bradley continued, reaching into his jacket and removing a thick envelope. "Maria's evidence about the mining claims has been authenticated. If Hayes goes to trial, he'll be convicted of fraud and probably murder. But that's only if there are witnesses left to testify." The implication was clear. The hunting party wasn't just about eliminating wolves, but about silencing anyone who could expose the larger conspiracy. Curtis and his men were fighting for more than principle or safety. They were fighting to protect a criminal enterprise worth thousands of dollars in mineral rights. As Bradley rode back toward town, Jake found himself standing in his cabin doorway, the cavalry saber across his knees and Shadow lying at his feet. The wolf's presence was both comforting and troubling, a reminder that some loyalties transcended rational calculation and that some stands had to be made regardless of the odds. The night passed slowly, filled with the sounds of preparation, and the knowledge that morning would bring a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Shadow and his pack, but the future of everything Jake had worked to build since Tommy's death. Whatever happened in the coming hours, Jake was determined to face it with the same honor that had guided 3 generations of Morrison men who had carried the family saber into battle. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of horses and men moving through the darkness, Curtis and his hunting party positioning themselves for the final assault. The morning would bring violence and possibly death, but it would also bring resolution to questions that had haunted Jake for far too long. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, Jake rose from his chair and buckled the cavalry saber to his side. Whatever the cost, he would not retreat from the principles that made life worth living. The hunting party moved like a military unit through the pre-dawn darkness, their horses' hooves muffled by careful wrapping and their equipment secured to prevent rattling. Curtis had positioned his men in a sweeping arc that would drive the wolf pack toward Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge that offered no escape route and perfect killing ground for men with rifles. Jake watched their advance from a ridge overlooking the valley, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was outnumbered and outgunned. Beside him, Shadow lay pressed against the earth, his amber eyes tracking the movement of horses and men below. The young wolf seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his body tense with the controlled alertness of a predator preparing for battle. The storm lantern Jake carried was an old cavalry model, designed to burn steadily even in harsh conditions. Its metal housing bore the dents and scratches of long service, and its glass chimney had been replaced twice over the years. Now it served as both beacon and symbol, a light in the darkness that would guide him toward whatever confrontation awaited in the canyon. As Curtis's men closed their trap, Jake could see the wolf pack moving through the forest below, apparently unaware of the danger surrounding them. But as he watched more closely, he began to recognize patterns in their movement that suggested something more complex than simple flight. The wolves were splitting into smaller groups, taking positions that would allow them to observe and respond to threats from multiple directions. Shadow lifted his head and released a low howl that carried across the valley like a musical note. Immediately the pack's movement changed, becoming more coordinated and purposeful. Jake realized with amazement that Shadow was directing his family's response to the human threat, using vocalizations and position to communicate tactical information. Shadow. Her shots rang out as Curtis's men opened fire on what they thought was a trapped pack. But instead of panicked animals, they found themselves facing creatures that seemed to anticipate their moves and respond with disturbing intelligence. The wolves scattered into the rocks and shadows of the canyon, using terrain and darkness to neutralize the hunters' advantage in numbers and firepower. Jake spurred his horse down the rocky slope toward the canyon, the storm lantern swinging from his saddle horn and casting wild shadows on the stone walls. He could hear Curtis shouting orders to his men, trying to maintain coordination as the carefully planned hunt descended into chaos. "There!" Curtis's voice echoed off the canyon. "Walls. Morrison's coming down the south slope. Take him alive. Hayes wants to ask him some questions before we finish this." Jake drew his father's cavalry saber as he reached the canyon floor. The familiar weight of the weapon bringing back memories of training and discipline from his military days. The blade caught the lantern light as he rode into the midst of Curtis's scattered forces, his presence adding another variable to an already complex situation. The hunting party had expected to face trapped animals and a lone rancher of questionable mental stability. Instead, they found themselves dealing with a coordinated defense that used every advantage of terrain and darkness. Shadow's pack moved through the rocks like water, appearing and disappearing with timing that suggested intelligence far beyond normal animal behavior. "This ain't natural," one of Curtis's men called out, his voice tight with fear. "Wolves don't fight like this." Jake used the confusion to position himself between the hunters and the main group of wolves, his storm lantern held high to create a focal point that would draw attention away from Shadow's tactical movements. The light cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, making it difficult for the hunters to maintain accurate aim while providing the wolves with additional concealment. Curtis himself emerged from behind a boulder formation, his rifle trained on Jake's position. "End of the line, Morrison. You've caused enough trouble for decent folks." "Decent folks don't murder women and children for mineral rights," Jake replied, his voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space of the canyon. The accusation seemed to strike Curtis like a physical blow. His expression shifted from confident aggression to something approaching uncertainty, suggesting that Hayes's foreman hadn't been told the full extent of his employer's crimes. "You don't know what you're talking about," Curtis said, but his voice lacked conviction. Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the canyon mouth. Sheriff Bradley appeared at the head of a small group of riders, his badge glinting in the lantern light and his face set with official determination. "Stand down, Curtis," Bradley called out, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "You and your men are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and destruction of evidence in a federal mining fraud case." Curtis's reaction was immediate and violent. Instead of surrendering, he swung his rifle toward Bradley, his face twisted with the desperation of a man who had gone too far to retreat. "You're too late, Sheriff. By the time we're done here, there won't be any witnesses left to testify." The canyon erupted in gunfire as Curtis's men chose sides, some laying down their weapons in surrender, others joining their leader in a final desperate gamble. Jake found himself in the center of the chaos, using his horse's mobility and the storm lantern's light to create confusion among the hostile shooters, while Shadow and his pack moved through the shadows like avenging spirits. Through the noise and confusion, Jake could hear Shadow's distinctive howl rising above the gunshots, not a sound of fear or pain, but a war cry that seemed to rally his pack for a coordinated assault on their human enemies. The young wolf had learned not just to trust humans, but to distinguish between those who meant harm and those who sought justice. The storm lantern swung wildly as Jake maneuvered his horse through the rocky terrain, its light creating a beacon that drew both enemy fire and allied attention. In that flickering illumination, man and wolves fought side by side against forces that threatened everything they had worked to protect. The battle in Devil's Canyon had lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Curtis lay wounded, but alive, his rifle shattered by a ricocheting bullet and his will to fight broken by the realization that he had been fighting for a lie. Most of his men had surrendered once they understood the true nature of Hayes's conspiracy, leaving only a handful of die-hard supporters who had fled into the high country rather than face territorial justice. Sheriff Bradley was securing the prisoners when the sound of a single horse approaching at full gallop echoed off the canyon walls. Jake looked up from tending a bullet graze on Shadow's shoulder to see Samuel Hayes himself riding toward them, his face twisted with the fury of a man who had lost everything and blamed everyone but himself. Hayes should have been in jail, but his lawyer's influence and a hefty bribe to a corrupt guard had secured his temporary freedom. Now he rode like a man possessed, his expensive rifle gleaming in the morning light, and his eyes holding the cold madness of someone who had crossed the line from which there was no return. "Morrison!" Hayes's voice boomed across the canyon, carrying echoes of rage and desperation. "This ends now between you and me." Jake rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the cavalry saber at his side. Behind him, Shadow struggled to his feet despite his injury, positioning himself between Jake and the approaching threat. The wolf's stance was protective rather than aggressive. Head lowered, body coiled for action, amber eyes fixed on the man who had murdered his original human protector. "It's over, Hayes," Jake called back. "Your men have surrendered, and Bradley has all the evidence he needs to convict you. Riding away now might save your life." Hayes's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Save my life? My life ended the day that wolf-loving whore Rebecca threatened to expose my business arrangements. Everything I've done since then has been about staying ahead of the noose." The admission carried clearly to everyone in the canyon, including several townspeople who had arrived with Sheriff Bradley. Maria Santos stood among them, her face pale but determined as she witnessed the final confrontation between the man who had murdered her friend and the cowboy who had chosen justice over safety. Hayes raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Shadow launched himself forward with a speed that defied his injury. The young wolf's leap carried him directly into the line of fire, his body intercepting the bullet meant for Jake's heart. Shadow hit the ground hard and lay still, his protective stance finally broken by the ultimate sacrifice. The sight of the wounded wolf triggered something primal in Jake's mind. Memories of his son Tommy, of other innocents who had died while he stood helpless, of all the times he had chosen safety over action. The cavalry saber seemed to draw itself as Jake moved toward Hayes, with the deadly purpose of a man who had finally found a cause worth dying for. Hayes tried to reload, but his hands were shaking with fear and adrenaline. Jake closed the distance. Between them, before the rancher could chamber another round, the ancestral blade moving in the patterns his grandfather had taught him during long winter evenings decades ago. The fight lasted only moments. Hayes was a businessman who had relied on others to do his violence, while Jake was a former cavalry officer whose muscle memory retained the skills of a warrior. The saber's edge found Hayes's gun hand, sending the rifle spinning away across the rocky ground. Hayes fell to his knees, clutching his wounded wrist and staring up at Jake with the wide-eyed terror of a man who had finally met consequences he couldn't buy or intimidate his way out of. "Please," he whispered, "I can pay you. More money than you've ever seen." Jake stood over him, the cavalry saber's point resting against Hayes's throat. For a moment, the temptation to end it, to ensure that justice was final and absolute, burned through his veins like fire. But as he looked into Hayes' eyes, he saw not a monster, but a broken man whose greed had consumed everything human about him. "Justice isn't mine to deliver," Jake said quietly, stepping back and lowering the weapon. "That's what courts are for." Sheriff Bradley moved forward to arrest Hayes, but the fight had gone out of the man entirely. He submitted to the shackles, with the vacant compliance of someone whose mind had retreated from a reality too painful to bear. Jake knelt beside Shadow, whose breathing was shallow but steady. The bullet had grazed the wolf's ribs rather than penetrating deeply, and while the wound was serious, it wasn't fatal. Shadow's amber eyes opened as Jake examined the injury, and the look that passed between them carried a recognition that transcended species, the acknowledgement of one warrior by another. Maria approached with her medical supplies, her movements careful and respectful as she began treating Shadow's wounds. "He'll live," she said softly, "but he's going to need time to heal." As she worked, the wolf pack emerged from their hiding places in the rocks, moving toward their injured leader with obvious concern. But they also approached Jake, sniffing cautiously at his hands and clothes before seeming to accept him as part of their extended family. The townspeople who had witnessed the confrontation watched in amazement as Jake interacted with the wolves, not as a master commanding pets, but as an equal member of a community that included both human and animal participants. The sight challenged everything they thought they knew about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Bradley murmured, watching as Shadow struggled to his feet and leaned against Jake's leg for support. "Never seen anything like that in 30 years of law enforcement." The immediate threat was over, but Jake understood that the larger questions raised by his relationship with Shadow would continue to challenge the community for years to come. Some would see his bond with the wolves as proof that humans and wildlife could coexist peacefully. Others would view it as dangerous sentimentality that threatened the natural order. But as Jake helped Shadow back toward the pack's territory, with Maria at his side and the weight of his father's cavalry saber comfortable at his hip, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Tommy's death, the peace that came from knowing he had chosen correctly when choice mattered most. 6 months after the confrontation in Devil's Canyon, Jake Morrison stood at the same fence line where he had first discovered Shadow trapped in Samuel Hayes's ornate gate. But everything had changed. The heavy iron bars that had once imprisoned a frightened wolf pup had been replaced with a simple wooden gate that featured an unusual design, a latch that could be opened from either side, allowing passage in both directions. The new gate had been Maria's idea, though Jake had done the carpentry work himself during the long winter evenings when snow made outdoor labor impossible. It stood as a symbol of the transformation that had overtaken not just his own life, but the entire Cedar Ridge community in the months since Hayes's arrest and conviction. Hayes himself now resided in the territorial prison in Deer Lodge, serving a sentence of 20 years for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of his wife and child. His confession, delivered in a moment of complete breakdown during his trial, had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to close the case. The mining claims he had fraudulently acquired were returned to their rightful owners, and the mineral wealth that had driven his crimes was being developed through legitimate partnerships that benefited the entire community. Shadow approached the gate from the forest side, no longer the frightened juvenile Jake had rescued, but a mature wolf in his prime. His pack had grown as well. 5 adults now, plus 3 pups born the previous spring. The injured shoulder from the canyon battle had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that Jake sometimes touched during their evening encounters, remembering the moment when the wolf had chosen to risk his life for a human friend. The relationship between Jake and the pack had evolved into something unprecedented in the region's history. The wolves maintained their wildness and independence, but they also served as unofficial guardians of Jake's ranch and the surrounding area. Predators that might threaten livestock learned to avoid the territory, while the wolves themselves seemed to understand the difference between animals under human protection and those that were fair game for hunting. This understanding hadn't come without challenges. In the early months after Hayes's defeat, several neighboring ranchers had remained skeptical of Jake's arrangement with the wolves. It had taken a series of incidents: a mountain lion driven away from the Henderson ranch, a pack of coyotes discouraged from raiding chicken coops, a lost child found and protected until human rescuers arrived to convince the community that the wolves were allies rather than threats. Sheriff Bradley had been instrumental in managing the transition, using his authority and diplomatic skills to mediate disputes and establish protocols for human-wolf interaction. His official reports to the territorial government had helped establish Jake's land as an informal wildlife sanctuary, protected by both law and community agreement. The most significant change, however, had been in Jake himself. The isolation and bitter self-recrimination that had defined his life since Tommy's death had gradually given way to a sense of purpose and connection that extended beyond his relationship with the wolves. His courtship of Maria had proceeded with the careful deliberation of two people who understood the value of patience and the importance of building trust slowly. Maria had moved her healing practice to a cabin Jake had built for her on his property, creating a partnership that combined her medical knowledge with his understanding of animal behavior. Together, they had developed treatments that drew on both traditional remedies and observations of how wolves cared for their own injured pack members. Their wedding the previous month had been a small affair, witnessed by Sheriff Bradley, a handful of close friends, and, to everyone's amazement, Shadow and his mate, who had watched the ceremony from the edge of the forest with what seemed almost like approval. Now, as Jake opened the wooden gate and stepped through to the wild side, Shadow approached with the easy confidence of a creature that knew itself to be among friends. The wolf's amber eyes held the same intelligence that had first captivated Jake, but now they also reflected something like contentment, the satisfaction of a leader who had successfully protected both his human and wolf families. Jake knelt and extended his hand, allowing Shadow to sniff and then gently nuzzle his fingers. The gesture had become a ritual between them, a moment of connection that bridged the gap between two different species while respecting the boundaries that kept each wild and free. "Your children are doing well," Jake said softly, speaking to Shadow as he often did, finding that the wolf's presence invited conversation, even if the words weren't understood. Growing strong and learning the old ways. Shadow's response was a soft rumble that might have been agreement or simply acknowledgement of Jake's voice. Behind him, his mate appeared with the three pups, now nearly adult-sized themselves, and displaying the intelligence and adaptability that seemed to run in their bloodline. As if sensing their father's approval, the young wolves approached Jake with cautious curiosity. They had been born into a world where humans could be trusted, where the scent of gunpowder didn't automatically mean death, where cooperation was possible between creatures that had traditionally been enemies. Jake watched them explore the area. Around the gate, their movements displaying the same blend of wildness and acceptance that characterized their parents. They would never be domestic animals, but they had learned lessons about survival that included the possibility of alliance with other species. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the peaceful scene. Maria rode up with a small group of visitors, officials from the territorial capital who had come to examine Jake's experiment in human-wolf coexistence. Their initial skepticism had given way to fascination as they witnessed interactions that challenged every assumption about predator behavior and wildlife management. "Remarkable," one of the officials murmured, watching as Shadow's pack moved through the forest with liquid grace while maintaining awareness of the human observers. "Absolutely remarkable." Jake rose and stepped back through the gate, closing it gently behind him. The latch clicked into place, but both he and Shadow knew that it would open again at the appropriate time. The barrier existed not to separate, but to define, marking the boundary between domestic and wild, while allowing passage when circumstances warranted. As the visitors departed, and evening settled over the valley, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared, grief-stricken man who had freed a trapped wolf pup 6 months ago had been transformed by the simple act of choosing compassion over convenience. He had learned that intelligence and loyalty weren't exclusively human traits, that wildness didn't automatically mean danger, and that the courage to do what was right often led to outcomes more positive than anything careful planning could achieve. Maria joined him on the porch as darkness fell, bringing coffee and the comfortable companionship of shared purpose. In the distance, Shadow's distinctive howl rose into the night sky, not a call of loneliness or territory, but a song that seemed to celebrate the complex harmony between civilization and wilderness. "Do you think they understand?" Maria asked, settling beside Jake and watching the forest where amber eyes occasionally reflected the cabin's light. Jake considered the question seriously, as he had learned to consider all questions about the relationship between humans and the natural world. "I think they understand better than we do," he said finally. "They understand that some things are more important than fear." As if in response to his words, Shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing, his mate and children beside him. For a moment, the two families, human and wolf, regarded each other across the small distance that separated their worlds. Then Shadow dipped his head in what seemed almost like a nod of acknowledgement before leading his pack back into the darkness. The wooden gate stood open in the starlight, ready to facilitate whatever encounters the future might bring between species that had learned to see past their differences to the common ground of survival, loyalty, and hope.